I mended the schoolteacher's broken wagon wheel. Then she said, "No man has ever stayed to finish the job. Some men make promises. Some men make excuses. And some men simply finish what they start, even when no one is watching to see if they will." She would tell people later that she almost didn't call out to him. That decision would change more than a wagon wheel. It would change who was allowed to leave and who was finally allowed to stay. Some men make promises. Some men make excuses. And some men simply finish what they start, even when no one is watching to see if they will. The difference between those men rarely announces itself. It shows up in small places: a fence post, a leaking roof, a wheel left broken in the mud, because finishing the job cost more than the man standing beside it was willing to pay. This is a story of a woman who stopped expecting anyone to pay it, and the man who paid it anyway. A dirt road outside a Colorado schoolhouse. A wagon tilted at a broken angle. A woman standing beside it. Rain gathering somewhere behind the hills. And a man on horseback who wasn't planning to stop. She would tell people later that she almost didn't call out to him. That decision would change more than a wagon wheel. It would change who was allowed to leave and who was finally allowed to stay. The town of Millbrook Hollow sat quiet beneath a gray autumn sky. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, obedient lines. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where nothing stayed private for long, and where reputations, once formed, hardened like clay left too long in the sun. Caleb Foster rode into that town the way he rode into most towns. Unhurried, unremarkable, a man who drew no attention, because he wasn't looking for any. He wasn't young, not old either. Somewhere in the stretch of life where a man has already learned most of his lessons the hard way and has stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. His saddlebags were worn, his boots older than they should have been, but his hands told a different story. Steady hands, capable hands, the hands of someone who had spent years fixing things other men had given up on. Nobody in Millbrook Hollow knew his name yet. They would, soon. For now, he was simply a stranger passing through on a road that led nowhere in particular, which was, in its own way, exactly where he wanted to be. Caleb didn't announce himself. He never did. 2 miles outside town, he passed a broken fence line sagging into a ditch. He noticed it, filed away, kept riding. That was his way. Not indifference. Attention. The kind of attention most people spend their whole lives failing to give the world around them. A mile later, a barn door hung loose on a single hinge, groaning faintly in the wind. He noticed that too, and kept riding. Because a man cannot fix everything he sees, but he can remember what bothers him. And very little bothered Caleb Foster more than something left broken that didn't have to be. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, white paint fading at the corners, a bell tower leaning slightly, though no one seemed to mind. And parked crookedly in the road just beside it, a wagon. One wheel had given out entirely. Splintered spokes. A rim bent at an angle that made the whole cart lean like a man favoring an old injury. And standing beside it, hands on her hips, was a woman who did not look like she needed rescuing. She looked like she was calculating how angry she was allowed to be. Caleb slowed his horse. Not because he intended to stop, because instinct made him look. And once he looked, something in him already knew he wasn't leaving. You planning to ride past, or you planning to help? The question came before he'd even fully stopped. Sharp, direct, no softness dressing it up. Caleb dismounted slowly. Wasn't sure I was invited to do either. You're not. A pause. Doesn't mean I don't need it. He studied the wheel, studied her, then knelt beside the wagon without another word. She watched him for a long moment, arms crossed, waiting for the part where he'd explain why he couldn't actually help. Men were good at that part. The explaining, the apologizing, the riding on. You don't have tools for this, she said. I've got enough. It's going to take a while. Didn't have anywhere to be. Something flickered across her face. Not warmth. Not yet. Suspicion, mostly. The particular suspicion of someone who has been let down carefully and often and has learned to expect a pattern before it repeats. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, the schoolteacher, Millbrook Hollow's own, respected, capable, and, according to nearly everyone in town, entirely too particular for her own good. She had turned down 2 proposals in 4 years, politely, firmly, without explanation that satisfied anyone. The town had drawn its own conclusions. Proud, difficult, waiting for a man who didn't exist. They said it at the general store. They said it after church. They said it the way people say things about a woman. They've decided they understand better than she understands herself. What they didn't say, because most of them didn't know, was that Eleanor Hayes had once been engaged, briefly, quietly, to a man who promised to build her a home before the first snow. He left before the foundation was finished. Not because he stopped caring. He simply stopped staying. And Eleanor had learned, in the years since, that there was a particular kind of loneliness reserved for women who were told they'd be provided for, and discovered too late that promises and permanence were not the same thing. She didn't tell Caleb any of this. Not yet, but it lived in the sharpness of her voice, in the way she watched him work, like she was waiting to be disappointed on schedule. The repair took longer than either of them expected. The spokes were worse than they looked. The rim needed reshaping entirely. An hour passed, then another. The sky darkened slightly, threatening rain that never quite arrived. Eleanor stood nearby, arms crossed, offering exactly the amount of help required to prove she wasn't asking for more than she needed. "You could stop," she said at one point. "Get it moving again. That's all I need." Caleb didn't look up. That's not the same as fixing it. Nobody's going to notice the difference. "I will." She frowned, not annoyed, confused, as though the sentence didn't fit any pattern she recognized. "It's just a wheel." Caleb finally looked up at her, calm, unbothered. Things left half-fixed don't stay fixed long. He returned to his work. She said nothing, but she watched him longer than she meant to. The sun dropped lower. Caleb kept working, methodical, unhurried. Not once did he glance toward the road, toward the town, toward anywhere he might rather be. That, more than anything, unsettled her, because in her experience, men left long before the job was done. They left when it got difficult, when it got boring, when something easier came along. But Caleb Foster simply kept working, as though finishing the wheel properly mattered more than the hours it cost him. When he finally stood, wiping his hands against his trousers, the wheel sat straight, solid, turning smoothly against the axle for the first time in what looked like months. Eleanor stared at it, then at him. "You didn't have to do all that." "I know. Most men wouldn't have." Caleb shrugged, already gathering his tools. "Then most men leave things broken." The words weren't meant as an insult. They weren't meant as anything at all. But they landed like one, because Eleanor Hayes had spent years surrounded by things left broken. A promise, a foundation that never became a home, a version of her own future that stopped arriving somewhere around her 25th year. She looked at the wheel, then at him, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost its sharpness. It came out flatter, quieter, almost bitter, though not directed at him. "No man has ever stayed to finish the job." Caleb paused. He didn't answer right away, because some sentences aren't questions. They're confessions wearing the shape of an observation, and a wise man knows better than to interrupt one. He mounted his horse without another word, tipped his hat once, and rode on toward town, leaving Eleanor standing beside a wagon wheel that would outlast every excuse anyone had ever offered her. She watched him go, longer than she intended to, then turned back toward the schoolhouse, telling herself it meant nothing. It would take her several days to admit that it did. By the following morning, half of Millbrook Hollow already knew. News in a small town moves faster than weather. At the general store, the conversation started before the coffee had finished pouring. "Heard a stranger fixed Miss Hayes's wagon wheel yesterday." "Fixed it? Or just patched it?" "Fixed it. Spent hours out there, from what I hear." A pause. "Hours?" "For Eleanor Hayes." Laughter followed. Not cruel exactly, just amused. The amusement of people certain they already understood the woman being discussed. She probably lectured him the whole time. Wouldn't put it past her. Poor man. More laughter. Someone else shook their head. She'll find something wrong with him, too. She always does. The room nodded in easy agreement, because Eleanor Hayes had built a reputation over years, one polite refusal at a time, too particular, too proud, waiting. Everyone assumed, for a man who simply didn't exist, what none of them considered was a possibility, that Eleanor wasn't waiting for a better man. She was waiting for a different kind entirely, the kind who stayed until the job was actually finished. Caleb heard none of the gossip. He wasn't listening for it. By midweek, he had taken up quiet work around town, mending a section of fence near the livery, repairing a hinge on the church door that had squeaked through 3 pastors and 2 decades of complaints. He didn't ask permission. He didn't ask payment. He simply noticed what was broken and fixed it the same way he noticed the schoolhouse steps sagging dangerously on one side the second time he passed them. Nobody saw him do the work, not directly, but Millbrook Hollow began noticing the results. A gate that no longer stuck, a step that no longer wobbled, a fence that no longer leaned, and a schoolteacher who found herself walking past each repair a little slower than necessary, studying the work the way she might study a sentence she wasn't sure she'd read correctly the first time. She didn't mention it to anyone, but she noticed, long before she admitted she was noticing. It was the schoolhouse steps that finally caught her directly. She arrived one morning to find them solid, level, silent beneath her boots for the first time in over a year. She stood there a long moment, staring down at wood that used to creak a warning every single day. Then she looked up, toward the road, toward the direction Caleb Foster had ridden 2 days earlier, and for the first time since the wagon wheel, she wondered exactly how long a man like that intended to stay, because in her experience, men who stayed long enough to fix one broken thing rarely stayed long enough to fix the next. But something about Caleb Foster didn't fit that pattern. And Eleanor Hayes, sharp, guarded, careful Eleanor Hayes, was beginning to suspect that this particular stranger wasn't finished yet. Not with the schoolhouse, not with the town, and perhaps, though she wasn't ready to say it aloud, not with her. There's a particular kind of danger that never announces itself as danger. It arrives disguised as paperwork, as a rumor traded over coffee, as a sentence spoken so casually that no one thinks to be afraid of it until it's already too late. By the time Millbrook Hollow understood what was coming for the schoolhouse, it had already been coming for weeks, and the woman standing closest to it had no idea she was standing in its path. The rumor started small, the way rumors in small towns always do. At the general store, a man setting down a crate of nails mentioned it almost in passing. Heard the railroads looking this direction again. They're always looking this direction. No, looking at the schoolhouse land specifically. A pause. Someone laughed. They've been saying that for years. Nothing ever comes of it. The conversation moved on, the way conversations do when a warning arrives dressed as small talk. Nobody thought much of it. Not the shopkeeper, not the customers, not even Eleanor, when she heard a softened version of it secondhand 3 days later. Land rumors were as common in Millbrook Hollow as bad weather. Everyone had heard one. Few had ever seen one arrive. She filed away the way a person files away something they've decided not to worry about, which is, of course, exactly how the most dangerous things arrive. Quietly, wearing the shape of something forgettable. Caleb, meanwhile, had not left town. 3 weeks now, long enough that Millbrook Hollow had stopped calling him a stranger and started calling him, cautiously, a fixture. He'd taken modest work at the livery, mended what needed mending, said little, watched much, and more than once, Eleanor found herself glancing toward wherever he happened to be working, telling herself it was simple curiosity. It wasn't, not entirely, but she wasn't ready to call it anything else yet. The storm arrived on a Thursday night, not the worst Millbrook Hollow had seen, but close. But something in her posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a door easing open a fraction of an inch. Still guarded, still cautious, but no longer fully closed. She let him fix the roof, barely, reluctantly, watching from a distance as though supervising a stranger she didn't entirely trust. Even though by now he was anything but a stranger, it wasn't the work she doubted. It was what accepting help had always seemed to cost her before. Because in Eleanor Hayes' experience, help was rarely free. It came with expectation, with obligation, with the quiet understanding that eventually, once she leaned on someone, they would use that leaning as a reason to leave. The same way a man once promised her a home and left before the walls went up. She didn't tell Caleb any of that. Not yet, but it lived in every clipped sentence, every unnecessary check on his progress. Every moment she reminded him, unprompted, that she didn't need him to stay. Caleb never argued. He simply kept working, because he understood something she hadn't said aloud. Trust wasn't something you could ask a person for. It was something you had to earn, one finished job at a time, whether or not she ever admitted she was counting. The rumor became real on a gray Tuesday afternoon. A notice appeared, tacked to the schoolhouse door, official enough to make Eleanor's stomach tighten the moment she read the first line. The town council was reviewing all municipal and public use land parcels, including, the notice specified, land currently designated for educational use. Pending review, pending assessment, pending decision, bureaucratic language, carefully bloodless. The kind of language designed to make an alarming thing sound routine. Eleanor read it twice, then a third time, and for the first time since the storm, the fear she'd been holding at arm's length stepped fully into the light. Warren Castell had not built his position in Millbrook Hollow through cruelty. He built it through patience, through paperwork, through the quiet, persistent accumulation of influence that powerful men mistake for inevitability. He sat on the town council. He sat on the bank's advisory board. And for the better part of a year, he'd been in private discussions with railroad surveyors eager to route a new spur line directly through the eastern edge of town, directly through land currently occupied by one modest, aging schoolhouse. Warren didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as practical. The schoolhouse served a handful of children. The railroad, in his estimation, would serve the entire county's future. And Eleanor Hayes, unmarried, unprotected by a husband's name or a family's influence, represented, to men like Warren, not an obstacle exactly, an opportunity, a weak point in an otherwise straightforward transaction. He raised the matter carefully during a private council session. The lands held under Miss Hayes' late father's original claim, he said. Unmarried women don't typically hold clear title to contested municipal land, not without complication. Another council member frowned. You're saying we could challenge it? Warren folded his hands. I'm saying it would be remarkably easy. News of the council's interest reached Eleanor within days. Not officially. Never officially. She was beginning to understand precisely how men like Warren Castell prefer to operate. Quietly, through channels she couldn't directly confront. Through language just vague enough to leave her no clear target to fight. She sat at her small kitchen table that evening, notice in hand, the same steady calm she wore for her students nowhere to be found. Because this wasn't a broken roof. This wasn't a wagon wheel. This was the one thing she built entirely on her own, the schoolhouse, her father's land, her independence. And it was being quietly, procedurally, taken apart by men who had never once asked her opinion on the matter. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Hayes did not know how to fix the thing in front of her. Caleb found her there the following morning, the notice still on the table, untouched since the night before. He didn't ask permission to sit. He simply did. Tell me, he said. And for once, Eleanor didn't refuse the help being offered. She explained it all. The land claim, her father, the vague, circling language of the council notice, the unmistakable shape of Warren Castell's intentions, even though his name appeared nowhere on the page. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her more than anything else he'd done since the day of the wagon wheel. I used to do survey work before I came through here. Eleanor looked up. You never mentioned that. Didn't seem important. Until now. He reached for the notice, studied it carefully, then set it down. Land claims like your father's, filed a certain way, a certain time, they're stronger than most people realize. Especially men counting on nobody checking the original filing. Something flickered in Eleanor's expression. Not quite hope, not yet, but close enough to frighten her almost as much as the notice had, because hope, in her experience, was the most dangerous thing a person could risk carrying. Over the following 2 weeks, Caleb worked in the background the way he always had, quietly without announcement. Only this time, the work wasn't lumber and nails. It was records, old filings at the county clerk's office, survey boundary markers half buried near the schoolhouse's eastern edge, a dusty original deed, filed under her father's name nearly 20 years earlier, that Warren Castell's carefully vague notice had conveniently failed to mention. Caleb said little about what he was finding, not out of secrecy, out of caution, because a case built too loudly could be dismantled before it was ready to stand. Eleanor noticed his absences, noticed the ink-stained fingers, noticed the late evenings he spent hunched over papers at the small desk near the schoolhouse window. She didn't ask, not directly, but something had shifted in her, a willingness, however reluctant, to let someone else carry part of a weight she'd spent years insisting on carrying alone. The town meeting was announced for the following Friday. Public, official, the council's formal review of outstanding municipal land questions, language broad enough to include the schoolhouse without naming it directly, and therefore broad enough to make Eleanor's stomach turn every time she read it. She told herself she would attend, speak if necessary, defend what she could. What she didn't expect, what no one in Millbrook Hollow expected, was that she wouldn't be defending it alone. Word reached Warren Castell 2 days before the meeting. A quiet conversation outside the bank, delivered by a council colleague trying badly to sound casual. Heard the drifter's been digging through old land records. Warren's expression didn't change. Which drifter? The one who's been doing work for Miss Hayes. Foster, I believe. Warren considered this for a long moment, then allowed himself to finish coldest smile Millbrook Hollow had never seen, because Warren Castell rarely smiled where anyone could witness it. Let him dig, he said quietly. Paperwork doesn't matter if there's no schoolhouse left standing to argue over. He turned back toward his office window, toward the town spread out below him, orderly, obedient, entirely unaware of how close it stood to changing. And before his colleague left the room, Warren added one final sentence. Quiet, certain, the kind of sentence that settles into a room and refuses to leave. She'll lose that schoolhouse. A pause, and this time, there won't be a wheel left to fix. There are moments when an entire life seems to narrow into a single room, a single decision, a single sentence spoken in front of people who have already decided, quietly, what they expect to happen. For Eleanor Hayes, that moment arrived on a cold Friday evening inside the Millbrook Hollow Town Hall, and by the time it ended, the town would understand something about her they had never bothered to ask. The hall filled early. Farmers still in their work clothes. Shopkeepers who closed early for the first time in memory. Mothers who had once sat in Eleanor's classroom themselves, now grown, now watching their own children through the same schoolhouse windows she spent years keeping warm and dry. Nobody wanted to miss it. Not because they understood what was truly at stake, because they sensed, the way small towns always sense these things, that something was about to be decided that couldn't be undecided afterward. Eleanor sat near the front, spine straight, hands folded, the same composed stillness she wore on ordinary days, though nothing about this day was ordinary. Caleb sat beside her, silent, steady, a folder of papers resting on his knee, edges worn from 2 weeks of careful, quiet work nobody in the room yet understood the weight of. At the front of the hall, behind a long table, sat the council, and beside them, composed and unhurried, sat Warren Castell, confident, certain, a man who had learned long ago that most disputes were won before anyone entered the room, simply by making sure the paperwork favored the powerful. He looked at Eleanor once, briefly, the way a man looks at an obstacle he has already stopped worrying about. He had no idea how wrong that certainty would prove to be. The council chairman called the meeting to order. The room settled, the kind of silence that exists only when an entire town holds its breath at once. We're here, the chairman began, to review the status of several municipal land parcels, including the schoolhouse property currently held under the Hayes family claim. Warren rose first, smooth, practiced, He spoke of growth, of opportunity, of a railroad spur that could bring prosperity to every family in Millbrook Hollow for generations. He spoke of the schoolhouse not with malice, but with the careful, reasonable tone of a man convinced he occupied the side of progress. The claim itself, he added, almost as an afterthought, raises certain questions. An unmarried woman, holding land through an inherited filing, during a period when such filings weren't always properly documented. He let the sentence hang there, vague enough to sound procedural, sharp enough to do exactly what he intended. Several council members nodded slowly. The room shifted, uncertain, the way a crowd shifts when it senses the ground moving beneath a story it thought understood. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She rose slowly, no notes in her hands, no prepared speech, just the same steady composure she'd carried since the day a stranger knelt beside her broken wagon wheel and refused to leave until it was fixed properly. "My father built that schoolhouse," she said, her voice carried easily across the silent room, "with his own hands, the same hands that filed that land claim, fully and legally, the year I was 12 years old." She paused, not for effect, for breath, because what came next required all of it. "I've spent most of my life being told what I was allowed to keep." Another pause, longer this time. "When my father died, people told me the school would close, that a young woman couldn't run it alone. I kept it open anyway. When my engagement ended, people told me I'd never find contentment without a husband's name attached to mine. I built a life anyway." Her eyes moved briefly toward Warren, steady, unflinching. "And now I'm being told that the land my father left me might not really be mine, because apparently being unmarried makes a woman's ownership of anything a question rather than a fact." The room had gone utterly still. "I am not asking this council for charity," she said. "I am asking you to look at the deed my father filed legally 20 years ago and tell these people the truth instead of a convenient version of it." She sat down. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of a town quietly recalculating everything it thought it understood about the woman it had spent years describing in careful, dismissive whispers. Warren rose again, unbothered, ready to steer the room back toward procedure. "Sentiment is admirable," he said smoothly, "but land disputes aren't settled with feeling. They're settled with documentation. And the documentation surrounding this claim remains, at best, incomplete." He turned toward the council, confident the matter would end there. It didn't, because Caleb Foster stood. The room shifted again. Curious this time, because most of Millbrook Hollow still thought of him as the quiet drifter who fixed fences and mended wheels, not a man who belonged at the front of a land dispute. Caleb walked forward without hurry, set the folder on the table, opened it. "Before I came through Millbrook Hollow," he said, "I did survey work, boundary filings, deed verification, enough of it to recognize when a claim's being challenged on technicalities instead of facts." He laid out the documents one at a time. The original 1868 filing, Eleanor's father's signature still legible beneath 2 decades of dust. The county boundary survey, matching precisely to the schoolhouse's current footprint. A witness transfer of inheritance, properly recorded the year Eleanor turned 18. The exact filing Warren's vague notice had conveniently never mentioned. "The claim isn't incomplete," Caleb said quietly. "It's inconvenient." He looked toward Warren, calm, unshaken. "There's a difference." Murmurs moved through the crowd. Council members leaned toward one another, papers exchanging hands. Warren's composure, for the first time all evening, showed the faintest crack, a tightening at the jaw, a stillness that hadn't been there minutes earlier. The chairman studied the documents for a long moment, then looked up. "This appears considerably more thorough than concerns raised tonight." Warren opened his mouth, closed it again, because there was very little left to argue against paperwork that simply, undeniably told the truth. Before the council could formally close the matter, the chairman turned toward Caleb. "Curious, Mr. Foster, if I may ask, why go through all this trouble? You've no claim to that land yourself." The room quieted again, waiting. Caleb glanced briefly at Eleanor, then back at the room. When he spoke, his voice was plain, unpolished, entirely without performance. I don't fix things because I have to, he said. I fix them because walking away from something broken never once felt like freedom to me. He paused. This town almost let something worth keeping fall apart over paperwork nobody bothered to read carefully. I wasn't going to stand by and watch that happen. Not to the schoolhouse. Another pause. Quieter. Only Eleanor seemed to understand what came next wasn't only about the building. Not to her either. The room stayed silent. Eleanor did not move, but something in her expression shifted quietly, permanently, the way ground shifts long after the storm that caused it has passed. The council's decision came swiftly. Unanimous. The Hayes land claim, fully upheld. The schoolhouse, fully protected. Warren Castell's proposal, quietly, formally set aside. He left the hall without speaking to anyone, composed on the surface, diminished underneath it, because men like Warren rarely lose loudly. They simply stop mattering as much as they once did, and the town gradually begins to notice. The crowd dispersed slowly into the cold evening air. Handshakes, nods, a few quiet apologies from people who'd spent years calling Eleanor too proud, too particular, too difficult to understand. She accepted them graciously, because vindication, she was learning, didn't require anger to be satisfying. It only required the truth, finally being seen clearly. Several days later, the schoolhouse steps sat quiet beneath a pale morning sun. Caleb knelt near the bottom step, tightening a loose board that had nothing wrong with it at all. Eleanor stepped outside, watching him for a moment before speaking. That board's fine. Didn't say it wasn't. Then why fix it? Caleb glanced up, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Some things don't have to be broken to deserve attention. Eleanor crossed her arms, but the sharpness that once lived behind that posture had softened into something closer to fondness. You're not planning to leave, are you? It wasn't quite a question. Caleb set down his tools. Stood. Wasn't planning to. Eleanor studied him, the same way she studied him the day he knelt beside her broken wagon wheel. Testing him, half expecting an excuse that never came. None came now either. No man has ever stayed to finish the job, she said softly. The same words. Spoken differently this time. Not flat, not bitter. Something closer to wonder. Caleb held her gaze. Guess it was time somebody did. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved gently across the schoolyard, and Eleanor, who had spent years finishing her own sentences because no one had ever stayed long enough to finish them with her, found herself doing something she hadn't done in longer than she could remember. She let someone else speak next. Down the road, half forgotten beside the old barn, the wagon wheel Caleb had mended weeks earlier still turned steadily against its axle. No longer broken. No longer patched together out of necessity. Simply repaired. Properly. Completely. Carrying weight reliably. The way it was always meant to. Much like the schoolhouse it had once carried supplies to. Much like the town that had almost lost it. Much like the woman who had spent her whole life believing nobody stayed long enough to finish anything that mattered. And much like the man standing quietly beside her now, in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. The wheel turned once more. Steady, certain, a small, quiet reminder that some things, once properly mended, simply hold.